Ever since the dawn of humankind, we've sought the origins of our life and its purpose. Some have chosen to look to science, religion, or philosophy for answers. Many have turned to the great masters such as Lao Tzu, the Buddha, and Jesus Christ for spiritual illumination. Still others have sought truth through their own direct experience. All of us are searching, knowingly or unknowingly, for enlightenment, truth, and harmony in our lives. This program, hosted by Dr. Gregory Penn, will help you aspire to a more fulfilling and rewarding life.
Every day we take a step, we understand. The closer that we get, we'll find in who we are. We choose between the left and right, the ups and downs, the darkness or the light. We'll find in who we are.
Good morning and happy Easter to you, and welcome to our program Aspire. We're not going to take the usual Easter approach that most people take at this time of year. I'd like to take a deep and significant look at this portion of the life of Jesus, this crucifixion and this concept of him being in the Garden of Gethsemane, because they are important points in our spiritual unfoldment as well. You know, there is a tendency to put Jesus in this tiny little religious box and say that this is the day that he resurrected and this is the day that he died for our sins. Well, I'd like to take a different approach with you. If you're ready for a new idea, an unorthodox point of view, why don't you plan to stay tuned for our special show on Easter? You know, Easter, like so many things around biblical times and around the biblical setting, even around Jesus, has turned into nothing more than a sensationalistic myth. We only look at the physical part of it. And because of that, we only see paradox in Easter. We see the paradox of a man that we are told by Christianity is a man who was born perfect, never did anything wrong within his life, healed people, resurrected people, was basically the ideal man, the man that they call the Son of God, taken and put on a cross to suffer one of the most humiliating and painful deaths that a person can die, crucifixion. You die by suffocation. Sometimes it took days before a person would die. And one has to ask oneself, is this the reward that you get? Christianity has kind of covered this up by saying this is what God wanted. It was supposed to happen this way. But what kind of God would do that to his only begotten Son? I don't think it works that way. I think there's a lot more to the story than what they would have us believe. And I'd like to offer to you this morning a bit of an alternative on that. We have to go back a little bit, though, to understand the nature of all of this. Please understand, ladies and gentlemen, that metaphysics, while it has been a fad lately and people are very much into reincarnation and life and death and reading all sorts of books like that, that metaphysics really, in its deepest, most profound way, is in essence a way of life. It is to cause a death in us that we may find a new life, a life that is far more powerful, far more meaningful. The way we can understand all of this is to deeply look at Jesus, because in the Garden of Gethsemane and on the cross, we get to see the depth and the breadth of Jesus. We get to see a man struggling to find his spirituality, or what we call in Christianity, the Christ. So let's look at it a little deeper. You know, the disciples never really understood Jesus. If you will remember, as they sat and had what was known of as the Last Supper, all of them were very sure that they would never betray Jesus. Do you remember what Peter said as he stood up and he said, "I will never betray you"? And Jesus looked at him and said, "Before the cock crows, you will betray me 3 times. Peter never believed that, and yet he finds himself doing it. The disciples really weren't aware of who Jesus was. They looked at him as a person that could deliver them and their people from the oppression of the Roman government, the Roman Empire. That's what they wanted. They wanted a leader. They didn't understand that what they had in the midst of them was a spiritual master, someone who was going to take them a lot further than just the physical boundaries of freedom. He was going to take them to the ultimate freedom of liberation. The liberation was not from the Roman Empire, an oppressive way of life. The liberation was from his own ego, his own mind, and his own body. You see, Jesus didn't come to this world to save it, as so many people want to believe. No one human being can save the planet. Salvation is in your hands, in my hands, not in any one person who lived 2,000 years ago. The teachings of Jesus are themselves the very salvation. They are the liberation. And Jesus himself is about to go through a very interesting and beautiful transformation. That of being chained to his ego, his body, to that of being free in his spirit. But this transformation, this crucifixion, which became a bridge from the man to the divine, is a very difficult bridge that we all need to face, and that we will all face one day in our spiritual growth. Some people think that spiritual growth is nothing more than just being happy and having lots of money and thinking positive thoughts. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, we get to see the depth of what real spirituality is about. Because in spirituality, a true master teaches us to die. Not just the physical death, but to die from our ego, to die from our fears, to die to our vanity, that we may become alive. For the first time in our life, to be whole in God, which is what the word Christ means, to be whole in God. We find Jesus and that personal struggle in the Garden of Gethsemane to be, in my opinion, one of the most powerful of all teachings. We get to see him as he really is, struggling with himself. So Jesus brings 3 of his favorite disciples into the garden to pray with him and giving him moral support. And he says to them, "Sit here while I go pray yonder." We're going to see some different aspects about what prayer is all about. It's very important that we understand that. You see, Jesus the man is now going to pray out of his will. The human part of him does not want to die. He knows he must go through this for his own spiritual evolution, but he resists it. That should be a very good sign to all of us, because we've all felt this. I love these words that he gives to us. He says, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death." He's asking for God to deliver him. His soul hurts. He knows exactly the pain that he's going to go through. And he's reluctant. He's not reluctant because he's a bad person. He's reluctant because his flesh is crying out saying, "No, no, no." It's an interesting point here. Why would a man who was supposedly born perfect, who resurrected many people in his life, healed many people within his life, why would he be hesitant towards death? It was simply because he was not, but his body, his ego mind was. There are certain things that you and I need to give up. And let me give you a little key in this whole thing. All of spiritual growth has nothing to do with the idea of what you accept and what you deny in your mind. It's not a matter of positive living or positive thinking. The depth of your spirituality will depend on how willing you are to give up things, to surrender, to let go. The more you let things go within yourself, the less attachments you and I have in our life, the more quickly we come to God. We are told that in the garden, he fell on his face, which is an Eastern term, meaning that he got humble, he groveled a little bit. And he said to God in his prayer, "Oh, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." Isn't that an interesting thought? He's actually begging God out of his humanity, his willfulness, "Oh God, deliver me." If we look at most of our prayers, they are nothing more than trying to deliver us from a problem. Deliver me from my illness. Deliver me from my poverty. Maybe you're praying for a friend of yours or someone in your family that is ill. And isn't it interesting that always our prayers are to deliver us from something without us ever changing? Jesus is asking for deliverance without any change within him. It's typical of a lot of us. His prayer was agonizing. And in that agony, Jesus goes back to the disciples. And where does he find them? He finds them asleep. He becomes very annoyed with them, extremely annoyed. He wakes them up. He says, "Can't you stay awake not just 1 hour with me?" The disciples try to wake up. And he goes back into the garden again to pray, to beg that this cup would be removed from him. And he does it again, only this time with a different twist. Now, instead of praying the usual prayer that most people pray to be delivered, he says, "Oh, my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me except that I drink it, thy will be done." And here is where we see the two sides. Jesus had a personal will. A will that said, I don't want to die. I want to stay a little longer. I want to work a little more. I want to do more. I want to cling to this body. I want to cling to this mind. That was his human side. We all have it. We all feel a reluctance towards spiritual growth. In the many years that I've been a teacher, I noticed that I can take some of my students only so far. And then there's kind of this line of demarcation that we have. It's a line that kind of says, if you step over this, you'll never be the same again. You'll never be the same person that you used to be. You're going to have to drink this cup to get over here to the other side. Most students won't take that step over. It would mean that they would have to drop their literal, rational, logical thought. It would mean they'd have to stop living from their body and their mind and start living from their heart, to develop kind of a deep sensitivity towards their spirituality. And most people right there say no, because there's no more tradition involved in it. You see, the key is that Jesus did really something quite dramatic. Every spiritual master comes not to teach us how to live in and of the world, but how to die, believe it or not. How to die that we may find our life again. Die to our fears, die to our anger. Jesus said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And when he could see the difference between the spiritual side of him, which is eternal, and that physical side of him, which was weak, that is when the process towards the death that would bring forth life started to occur. You see, there's more to the crucifixion. There's more to this whole experience of Easter. It is our experience. I'm going to take a moment right now, and I'll be right back with some insight on the crucifixion and resurrection. In the Garden of Gethsemane, we learn a lot about the personal agony of Jesus preparing for, well, the death of his physical self. But on the cross, we see it more than ever before. I think it's kind of interesting that traditional forms of Christianity in the Western world use the cross as a symbol for their master, or for their teacher, or for their Christ. The cross is a blatant symbol of death, of cruel death. I'm not so sure that that should be our symbol. I've never personally liked it, never really used it. And yet so much has been learned from that intimate moment that we know of, that we've had recorded, where Jesus on the cross says some very interesting things about the shedding of his physical body, making that bridge over to his Christ nature. One of the first things that all historians and everyone is always interested in is that comment he made, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" A lot of people don't like to talk about that because it sounds as though Jesus has given up on God. The human side of us always gives up on God, especially when there's trials and tribulations and problems. I'm sure you have gone through periods in your life, crises in your life, where you have felt like you were on the cross, so to speak, saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" I think it's a pretty natural feeling that a lot of us have. And our ego and our mind, our physical self, is always going to feel these things. I'm sure Jesus felt it in his own life. At that particular moment, I'm sure he was questioning many things. His physical side, his fleshly side, was crying out for salvation. But you see, God doesn't answer those kinds of prayers. You see, that is a prayer of desperation. That is the prayer of our humanity. The greater part of Jesus was already beginning to die and become alive again, born again, so to speak. The greatest aspect of Jesus was yet to be seen. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" One should not be ashamed of that. It's the human side of us crying out, looking for some sort of life, some sort of meaning, some sort of purpose to maybe the problems that we are going through. But the key is to understand it, that God never forsakes us. God never betrays us. We will find that out a little later on in the episode of Jesus being on the cross. But the main thing is that you know that. You are never forsaken by God. No positive affirmation or physical prayer will ever teach you that. To know that God has never forsaken you is to know it in your heart. to take time to be quiet in your meditation time and to listen. Everything that Jesus talks about on the cross, from this point on, now becomes a point of shedding his physical paranoias and fears that he might find a deeper, more profound meaning. You see, there'll always be that hesitation, that moment where the river reluctantly flows to the stream. And that's what Jesus was feeling when he said, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" He's just having that one tiny moment. But you know, after that moment came a most beautiful, so to speak, beginning of the resurrection. And to me, this was the beginning. There's nothing wrong with having a little reluctance. Please remember something. Our ego, our fears will always be reluctant to be washed away in us. Never feel bad for the feelings that you have maybe of being betrayed. Just remember, you've never been betrayed by God. You never will. It's in the next moment that we find Jesus finding resolution in himself. And again, in my opinion, the beginning of the resurrection happened right here, the great moment. He looked at the people who were around him, who had taken him, put him on this cross. He probably saw his own disciples standing before him. And he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." What can be said at a moment like that? What a beautiful thing. He wasn't forgiving them. He was allowing forgiveness to flow through him. And hopefully they would forgive themselves. You see, this is a very deep and significant moment, because forgiveness does not happen due to the mind. It does not happen due to emotions. It does not happen due to thoughts. It happens from the heart. Forgiveness is a spontaneous action from the heart that can only come from the God within us. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He recognized that humanity acted out of ignorance, not out of basic misunderstanding, but out of ignorance. We are a very ignorant lot, a lot of us, and we need a lot of forgiveness. We do a lot of things thinking that we are doing things in some sort of good way, only doing them out of ignorance. And as we do these things out of ignorance, we often find ourselves doing things that are hurtful. I hear many people today say to me that if Jesus came back, we would never crucify him again. Father, forgive us, for we know not what we do. Jesus was a very beautiful, outspoken master, and the way of the Christ, well, I think we would resist it again. I wouldn't be surprised if it could happen all over again. In fact, I feel it would. You see, the Christ is only realized from the deepest sense of our heart. If you would like a beautiful experience at this Easter time, then it depends upon your ability to forgive. Your reluctance to forgive keeps things from happening within you, creates resistance and misunderstanding. Jesus is beginning to do something very beautiful. He's beginning to shed his ego. The final breath of Jesus was not the final breath of his life. Really, it was the beginning of his life. It is said that he looked up and said, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." That is a very important thought. It was at that moment that the total release of Jesus the man disappeared. Jesus the man as a person disappears, but the Christ appears. One of the most classic and beautiful stories about the resurrection of Jesus comes in the Emmaus walk. Some people don't believe that Jesus resurrected. I don't think of it in terms of the way Western people think of Jesus resurrecting with his physical body. I think you had to have a different set of eyes to be able to see the resurrection of Jesus. And one of the classic stories about that is Jesus on the Emmaus walk. After the crucifixion, 3 days later, 2 of his disciples were making their way to Jerusalem from Emmaus. Jesus walked over to them and asked if he could travel with them. The distance is about 3 miles, we are told. On that journey, on that walk, the 2 disciples, who are not identified in the Bible, all we know is they are 2 of his disciples, do not recognize Jesus, but talk about the death of Jesus and what a tragedy it was. Finally, Jesus looks at them in kind of dismay, and he says, "O fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory?" You see, Easter does not depend upon our intellect. Jesus said, "O slow of heart Notice he didn't say, oh, slow of mind, slow of intellect, slow of belief. He said slow of heart. Because the true essence of Easter is found in the heart. Yes, it is true, Jesus was standing right there with them, but the disciples could not recognize who he was. Why? Because the mind can't believe what the brain cannot report. What? A man coming from the dead? That's impossible. And because the mind does not see the possibilities of it, it will not entertain it, even when it is shown to it. You know, we've heard that old saying, seeing is believing. Not necessarily true. I don't think seeing is always believing. The truth of the matter is that while Jesus the man died in the physical form, the Christ in him has always lived and lives eternally now in and through us. We are slow. We are slow in our hearts to believe all the truths that have been spoken. Jesus gave us a whole set of teachings, but we have forgotten them. This crucifixion thing, it really bothers some people. A lot of people in metaphysics don't understand it. A lot of people just cast it off. Everybody has to go through it. Even Buddha went through it as he sat under the Bodhi tree, vowing for 7 days and 7 full nights to find the reason for all human suffering. And in his enlightenment, he actually, so to speak, dropped his physical body. He did not live from it any longer. You know something? That's something that you and I, when we are ready for that kind of spiritual experience, we will step over. Believe it or not, there will come a time in our life experience when we are ready to let go of the frivolous side of us, the frail side of us, the fearful side of us. In that moment, a very beautiful transition takes a hold of us, so to speak. We begin to be a different person. Easter is a very powerful moment. It is symbolic of a spiritual rebirth that we all tend to go through. The real key to it is not to be a fool, slow of heart. We must be keen and aware in our heart, for the secret of Easter is in our being. It's in our hearts. As I said earlier to you, Jesus has been put in this funny kind of religious box. We're told by Orthodox Christianity that Jesus died for your sins and mine. And we are also told, if we look at the symbols of Jesus, this cross, we always see the cross. Do you really think that Jesus would want to be remembered for this cruel form of death which humankind put him through out of its own ignorance and misunderstanding? I don't think so. He said, I came that ye may have life and have it abundantly. He also told us that we would be remembering him if we loved one another as he loved us. I think that's how we need to remember him. You know, this idea of Jesus, the man, the master, and the Christ are very important. We see the man in the Garden of Gethsemane wanting to be relieved of this very agonizing form of death. We see the master on the cross as he looks at the crowd around him and says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I hear people today say, if Jesus were to come back now, we would appreciate him. I don't believe that's true for 1 minute. As long as we remain in our ignorance, we will always be prone towards violent acts. And this violent act is just one of many that we would be prone to unless we allowed our consciousness to be raised to the Christ consciousness. It's hard for us to understand the meaning of the crucifixion and the meaning of the resurrection from our Western earthly point of view, but they definitely have great significance in our life.
Every day we take a step, we understand. The closer that we get, we're finding who we are.
Dr. Penn's wardrobe is provided by the Gentleman's Quarter, located in Del Mar and La Jolla, California.
The left and right.